Thank you all for coming out today. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Latinx Studies faculty. And while Emory does not have a formal Latinx Studies department or program, Emory College has made a commitment to promoting scholarship in Latinx studies and to increasing the number of Latinx faculty and students. They have demonstrated this commitment through recent faculty hires, including a designated Latinx Studies cluster hire in 2018 and by supporting public programming like today's talk. This year, aided by the James Weldon Johnston Institute for the Study of Race and Difference, faculty working in Latinx studies have organized a series of events around the theme resisting carceral states, policing and anti-Blackness in a Latinx context. This is a timely topic that allows us to explore questions of racial justice, intertwined discrimination, and allyship in light of current challenges. The next event on this in this series is on April 23rd, a panel featuring members of the Black Latinas No Collective. And so it is my privilege today to introduce you all to Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez is a professor of history, African American studies, and urban planning at UCLA, where she holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History. She is also the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, one of the nation's leading experts on race, immigration, and mass incarceration. She is the author of two award-winning books, Migra, A History of the U.S. Border Patrol in 2010, and City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, 2017. City of Inmates won the 2018 James Rowley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, the Athearn Prize from the Western Historical Association, the 2018 John Hope Franklin Book Prize from the American Studies Association, and the 2018 American Book Award. Currently, Professor Hernandez is the director and principal investigator for $1 Million Hoods, a university-based community drive research project that maps the fiscal and human costs of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. The $1 Million Hoods team won a 2018 Freedom Now Award from the Los Angeles Community Action Network for her leadership on the $1 Million Hoods team. Professor Lytle Hernandez was also awarded the 2018 Local Hero Award from KCET and PBS and the 2019 Catalyst Award from South LA Parent Student Advocacy Organization, Cadre. In 2019, Professor Hernandez was also named a James D. and Catherine MacArthur Fellow for her historical and contemporary work. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Lytle Hernandez.
Thanks, Carl. It's always good to see you. And I know you and I have many things to chat about, so we'll follow up, but it's good to be with everybody else. And thank you to the center and to the Faculty Association for the opportunity to chat. So what I thought I would do is provide an update from the $1 Million Hoods project based here at UCLA. I'm going to do this for a couple of reasons, but primarily because we've been able to do something here at UCLA to build a university-based but community-driven research initiative that's really at the heart of the movement to end mass incarceration here in Los Angeles. And before quarantine, before we were all staying home, everywhere I traveled, people wanted to know how we built this initiative. So now I'm taking a moment to work with the team to write up and begin talking about how $1 Million Hoods came to be. So that's what this presentation will be, is more an overview of our genealogy and how we grew as a research initiative. So for those of you who don't know, $1 Million Hoods is a research project based at UCLA, and we map the fiscal and the human costs of mass incarceration in our local community, which is Los Angeles. Next slide, please. We have three principles of our work. We are engaged in research. That is what we do. We are a research initiative. Community, namely the most impacted persons, most impacted by policing, incarceration, deportation, the carceral state, are driving the intellectual agenda of our work. And the outcomes that we are seeking are racial and social justice within our community. So we're very clear about who our audiences are and who are our community, what our community is. Next slide. I mean, this is really important as a university-based research agenda, that our principal audience is not the peer-reviewed journal. It's not our fellow colleagues. It really is community members and also movement leaders and policy leaders who can help to change the conditions of the world in which we live. Now, my personal entry into this story has come through my own historical scholarship, looking at the story of race and policing and mass incarceration, through writing Migra, which is really the story of the rise of the US Border Patrol and its efforts to police largely Mexicano, but also Latinx communities. And then my second book, City of Inmates, which is about the rise of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. And by using the conceptual framework of settler colonialism and listening to the wisdom of radical indigenous studies, I was able to come to an understanding of mass incarceration as a form of mass elimination, targeting unwanted, racialized, and queer populations in settler communities, white settler communities like Los Angeles. Now, that conclusion for me was particularly unsettling, and I needed to get far more involved. Sorry, my dog needs a little attention. I need to get far more involved at the front lines of the movement and mass incarceration. You cannot tell yourself that mass incarceration is a form of mass elimination and then stay in the ivory tower or sit on the sidelines. I needed to get much more engaged. So next slide. I was fortunate to be able to take sabbatical, and I spent a year just spending time with community organizations and movement leaders in the area who were launching at that time what was called a campaign to LA's No More Jails campaign, which was to stop new jail construction and hopefully wind down the jails that were already in place. And so we would meet at Chuco's Justice Center, and there were many organizations, the Youth Justice Coalition, Dignity and Power Now, the Californians United for Responsible Budget, and many others that came together. And it was in those conversations that we would talk about, we know who's being arrested and we know why, but we can't get the data from the LAPD or the LA Sheriff's Department. And so, okay, well, that's kind of what we do at the university, right? Is we get data, we find evidence, and then we try to make sense of it all. So I worked with the California Public Records Act and with our community partners to go after the data using really the letterhead of the university, the power of the institution to help force open some of the doors at the police department that didn't want to share the data. And once we acquired LAPD's arrest data and the sheriff's arrest data, we sat down and thought about what we wanted to do with it. We thought about the $1 Million Blocks project in Chicago that maps how much is spent on incarceration per city block. And we thought about the work of Eddie Ellis and the men incarcerated in New York who had come up with a geographical analysis of the crisis of mass incarceration. And we decided, James Nelson here on the bottom right, that we wanted to do a $1 Million Hoods project, which means mapping the cost of incarceration per neighborhood here in Los Angeles, right? Because LA is not a vertical city, it's a horizontal city. And so this is how $1 Million Hoods was born, through the intellectual genealogy of Eddie Ellis and the men at the imprisoned in New York, through the $1 Million Blocks project, and through our own community organizers here in Los Angeles. So next slide, please. Okay, so we went after the data. It was a hard fight. It took quite some time. We used the California Public Records Act, which is a statewide sunshine law similar to FOIA, which I think people are more familiar with. Next slide. It was not easy. We actually had to work with the ACLU to sue the LAPD at a certain point to guarantee access to the data and that the data was coming through in a timely fashion and relatively clean. We settled that lawsuit and it gave us access to a treasure trove of information. Next slide. We got what's called big data, right? We got arrest data on every arrest by the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department. We got gender, home address, date of birth, race, charges, disposition at the end of arrest. And then we had to figure out what the heck we're gonna do with all this. Now, if you know my work, you know I'm a historian. And I'm not a quantitative historian by any means, qualitative and archival. And so next slide. What we had to do is build a team. And so we looked around the university And we found where there were the technical resources in-house to be able to work with this data. And at UCLA, that's the UCLA Institute for Digital Research and Education. I'd be curious to hear what that is at Emory University, but they were available to work with me as a historian and the community to clean up this data and map it for the first time. So next slide. And what we did is we released what is called the $1 Million Hoods Map Room in 2016. And in our digital maps, every community that's lit up in red is a community where local authorities here in Los Angeles are spending more than $1 million per year locking up local residents just within the local jail system, not within state prisons, not within federal prisons. We are taking a very local look at the cost of jailing. We also provided the only publicly available list of what is being spent, but also what are the charges that are sending people to jail. And this was a counter narrative. So police will often tell you that they are here to keep us safe from chaos, right? Well, when you look at the $1 Million Hoods and the leading charges in those communities, in almost every community, it's two top charges: driving under the influence and possession of narcotics, both health-related crises in our communities. And so the argument is with community that if we take money out of policing and incarceration and we put it into health services, housing, education, employment, the institutions and practices that we know build thriving families and communities, all of us will be safer for that shift in public dollars. Next slide. Now the maps were like wildfire, right? And so people started looking at them, media was paying attention. People wanted to talk about how much we were overpaying and overspending to lock up local residents, disproportionately Black and brown and poor folks here in Los Angeles. Next slide. With all the attention we started to get, students started to show up and they're saying, what's going on over here at the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies with the $1 Million Hoods Project? And students from across the campus, again, disproportionately Black and brown students, wanted to come and learn about big data, right? So big data, computer science will always tell you they can't diversify, they can't bring in new students. The problem is the way they've been doing the work. At $1 Million Hoods, by prioritizing working with community and taking a critical stance toward policing, Black and brown students were showing up in large numbers to join our team, to do the work, to learn how to do data analytics and visualization. Next slide. I want to highlight here a couple of graduate students who are really important. And this is important because the project really operates with, yes, a faculty principal investigator, but graduate students play leading roles on the team and they mentor the undergraduate students, and we all jointly work with community. So there's 4 graduate students that I always want to lift up: Mark Vestal on the far left, Danielle Dupuy, Isaac Bryan, and Terry Allen. Each of them coming from different disciplines: history, public health, public policy, and education, came to the team and brought their leadership and their personal experiences with the carceral state to help it grow in really important ways. We'll talk about that. Next slide. Isaac Bryan and his expertise that he was developing in public policy really helped us to develop this new set of reports that we began to put out, these 1 to 2 page reports, not these long academic treatises, right? In 1 to 2 pages, we provide quick looks at new trends in policing in Los Angeles with data visualizations. So this report, Policing Our Students, showed that 1 out of every 4 students arrested by the Los Angeles School Police was a child in elementary school or middle school. It also showed that post an effort to reduce racial disparities in policing by the school police, those disparities had not only persisted, but grown in the last couple of years. And this too was able to enter into a movement that students and families were already leading to remove police from the school system. And it helped to provide a data background, a data base to the arguments that they were making that police don't make them safe. In fact, it makes our most vulnerable young people even more vulnerable to the violence of the state. So next slide. So this is an example of, all the press coverage that a report like this could get. And that happens because we write every report with at least one community partner. They own the report just as much as we do. They are co-authors whenever they choose to be cited as such. And then when they go to the school board or other actions, they're using the report like a tool in their tool chest in the movement to decarcerate whichever locale of the regime that they're looking at. So next slide. Here's an example of a report, and you see in the background here of this LA Times photograph. It was I think a press hearing that was being held at the women's jail. Here in LA, we were trying to stop the building of a new, larger women's jail. And it was a long campaign. And toward the end of the campaign, we were able to come in with a report that showed the phenomenal racial disparities impacting Black women, in particular when it comes to jail time here in Los Angeles, and the extraordinary amount of money that was being spent on locking up Black women and Latinas. And this report, again, was part of a broader movement that helped to bring a database, right, of understanding and analysis to the critique of incarceration in LA. So next slide. Okay, so again, we take all of this, we're always, we're not communicating with, I've never written an academic article on $1 Million Hoods, never will. Every time we communicate, it's with community. So here we're with the Community Coalition at a press conference talking about, I think this was about our report on bail and how much our community members are spending in bail bond deposits. Isaac Bryan was featured on a documentary about the money bail system. And our undergraduate students you see here are often really the principal spokespeople for our project, going from campus to campus, community meeting to community meeting, talking about what we're finding in the data and listening to community about what more they want to learn from the data that we have. So next slide. Okay, so again, the project just keeps growing and growing and growing. We've got all these Black and brown students who are showing up saying, teach me data analysis, teach me data visualization, show me how to do it with community, and show me how to do it in a way that will change the conditions of my life, right? In particular, that will dismantle the carceral state. And so when you set it up perfectly, the students will show up and we will be in a position to train a new generation with this tool of data analytics. Next slide. So here examples, Mandy Dixon. She says, I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I personally witnessed how LAPD negatively impacted my community, from hyper-policing, mass incarceration, to the breaking of the families. Being a part of $1 Million Hoods is my way to contribute something bigger than myself, which is progress and change. These are the words of undergraduate students on the team. Next slide. Jennifer Quintero. She said, at home, at school, and even my community, I saw what was going on, but I didn't know how to put it into terms, and I didn't know what it really meant. But MDH collects data, creates terms, creates reports. It puts everything into perspective. It explains what is happening to the community. Next slide. And Harold Grigsby. It's very rigorous research, but it is also community-based research that allows me to give back to the community while also giving back to myself. To say Harold is now at Harvard Law School. But the main thing that drew me in is we don't just pose our own questions. We ask the community for their observations and use the resource that we have at UCLA to answer the questions for them and equip them with that information. As a public serving university, they should be able to do this, to use us as such. Next slide. Before you knew it, our incredible, brilliant, beautiful students were winning awards left and right on their own terms by taking pieces of the research and using it for undergraduate and master's theses and for PhD dissertations as well. And one of the great nights we had was when we got to win an award alongside Dolores Huerta from the South Central Parents Association cadre. And here you just see them beaming. Next slide. So I don't know if we'll be able to play this, but this is an example of when we hold a data meeting. There are students out in the hallway, they're crammed in the room. It's just created an energy for the students to learn about data, analytics, and computer science. Next slide. Okay, now we don't just do data. In fact, that ACLU lawsuit, we got the data, but we also won access to 177 boxes of previously unseen LAPD historical records, which were on track for destruction. And so several of our student teams have spent the last couple of years working through these boxes of records. They have found what we call the war on drugs in a box. Money drops by the LAPD, home raids by the LAPD, school policing by the LAPD and their partners, and many other records documenting the rise of mass incarceration in LA and its impact upon most impacted communities. So students are really at the forefront, and here you see them working through those records of processing this new archival collection. Next slide. Terry Allen, one of our graduate student leaders, also trained undergraduate students to work with our community partners in collecting up oral histories with people who live in $1 million hoods or who grew up in a $1 million hood. So we have about 190 oral histories at this point, really looking into the issues of life, labor, and love in communities that are over-policed and hyper-incarcerated. What has been the everyday meaning of all of this in our lives? What has been the toll, the psychological toll, the spiritual toll, the family toll, and yes, the fiscal toll as well. So we have those oral histories, which we continue to do. Next slide. And we were heading toward a place of using this big data, using the archive, and using the oral histories to write what we call an equation for reparations. That with all this data, we wanted to demand reparations for the fines, the fees, and the money bail that has stripped our families of much needed resources. Reparations for the homes lost and the wages unmade due to wanton confinement. Reparations for the years stolen by broken windows policing. Reparations for the loved ones taken and harmed by police violence. Reparations for the parents taken by jail, prison, detention, deportation. Reparations for the children lost to foster care, and so much more that we've been learning from the archive, from the data, and the oral histories, bringing it together into a shared equation for reparations for the age of mass incarceration. Next slide. And then the summer of 2020 hit, and the uprising for Black life made us think in new ways about the work that we've been doing. In the LA, $1 Million Hoods and the movement that we are a part of had been pushing local authorities to the brink of making a commitment to ending the age of mass incarceration. And in fact, in March of 2020, just before we shut down, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors approved a plan called Alternatives to Incarceration, which would, in its most ideal sense, reduce, if not eliminate, the need for policing and incarceration locally. And so when you paired that with the uprising for Black life, we decided that, you know, some of the work that we've been doing about exposing the harms of policing was not as necessary anymore. And that at this breaking point, when LA was going to turn away from mass incarceration and begin building something new. And I don't know if that new is liberation or new regime. We'll have to see. That's still to be told. But at this moment, this historical turning point, we needed to pause and collect up the record of what has been done, by whom, to whom, and at what cost. So next slide. We are now a team that is archiving the age of mass incarceration. We're doing much the same stuff. We're collecting the data. We're collecting the LAPD records, and actually we're, with the support of the Mellon Foundation, acquiring additional LAPD records. We're taking oral histories with BIPOC community members who have been most impacted by mass incarceration. And we're working with our community partners to collect up what we call the carceral ephemera of our lives. The letters, the love letters that we sent back and forth to one another on both sides of the bars, the mixtapes that we've made, the poster art that we've made, and so on, to collect up the record on our own terms and in our own ways of what we've experienced and how we have fought back during this time period. So that 100 years from now, when someone comes back to tell the tale of the rise of mass incarceration and the people who dismantled it, there will be an archive that has been built on our own terms to tell our story in our own voices. So next slide. We are now $1 million hoods. We no longer map the fiscal and human cost of mass incarceration, but we archive the fiscal and human cost of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. And as you see here, we are a multi-generational team of undergraduate students, of graduate students, and myself and several other affiliated faculty at this point, all working in collaboration with community partners such as Justice LA and many other community groups to help push the movement for the end of mass incarceration and guarantee that whatever comes next, we build it with most impacted people and voices and concerns at the front of our considerations. So thank you. That is my presentation. And I look forward to chatting with you all about this project and maybe learning a little bit about what's going on in Atlanta and the work that you all are doing at Emory. I'm sure I look forward to learning from you.
No, so thank you for that presentation, Kelly. I'm always excited when I have the opportunity to hear you speak in general, but you know, so many of those images, and I think this is probably the first time I've actually seen you speak on $1 Million Hoods, like live, and so I'm super excited about this interaction. Just a reminder to participants in the room, all attendees, if you do have questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A function. You can send them to me directly. I'll filter in as many as time permits. And so I'll throw out a question as some of our guests start filtering some in. There's a lot to be said about the barriers to doing this kind of research, right? I mean, you opened up with having to join forces with ACLU to sue the LAPD to literally release these documents that otherwise they tried to destroy, right? And a colleague of ours posted today, I was actually looking for it on Twitter, Dan Berger, who's, you know Dan, and so but he posted, another stall, barrier, right? It's the stall tactics. And so there was a recent FOIA request, and the response was the estimated total page count for your request is 1,000 pages. Requests for between 700 and 3,000 pages are assigned to our second tier processing queue. To give you an indication of our existing second tier backlog, we are currently processing requests received in June 2014, right? So there's a stall tactic behind the release of these types of documents. And, it's very deliberate. How do you encourage folks to pick up the mantle who want to do this, this type of work, who are going to regularly meet these kinds of barriers?
Well, it does take a certain amount of patience, right? So our ACLU lawsuit was built upon years of denials that people had been accumulated and evidence of those denials. And you have to get that paper trail down. There's no other way around it. So being persistent, being patient, and also that I think for us is the luxury of being in the academy post tenure, right? Is that we can stay on it and keep our paychecks at the same time. We had no guarantee that data was going to come in within, I think it was about a year we got it. There was no guarantee that was going to happen, but we were going to build up the evidence that we would utilize one way or another to document police practice, whether it be around data transparency, around police practice itself. Those delay tactics, I think, are becoming even more entrenched in this moment where we are hearing police organizations across the country saying that they're losing their budgets. The threat of defund has forced them to shift staff out of public records and into, or discovery, and into street patrol or something, right? I'm not sure well, I don't think that's a legitimate argument by any means, but those stall tactics, I think, are hardening around that argument right now. And so if other people are experiencing that, I'd love to hear how they're countering those arguments in this moment.
Yeah, and again, I encourage you all, please, please, please submit some questions. I can sit here and talk with Dr. Hernandez all night, so I can do this as well. But we do want to hear some questions from the audience. Another question that comes to mind is, oh, wait, before we get to mine, somebody just dropped one, and so I'll go live with this one. Sergio Delgado Moya asks, what kind of resources or support from the university and institution were most important as you and your team built relationships with the community? Also, follow up is, what kind of resources or support were most important as you all confronted the stall tactics, et cetera, from the LAPD?
Yeah, in my case, because I don't have a technical background in computer science, certainly having a center on campus that was accessible to faculty from across the campus, to be able, once we acquired the data, to have professional staff in-house who could work with us on doing that. And that's a particular kind of unit on campus, because individual faculty members build up their own teams, but I wouldn't have access to their teams. You need to have a generalizable staff that's available to come in and out of faculty projects. So that was really, really important. Now, there's one other piece about the university that I do want to mention, and this is important, and I'm not sure what the right answer or solution is to this problem, but $1 Million Hoods is not my research project, right? It's a community project, and community said they wanted it to be based at UCLA, and community members, our partners, really drive the content of the work that we do, the mapping, the reports, all of that. And so we're accountable most to community. And I like it and it's also important to note that $1 Million Hoods doesn't really count in my promotions, personnel cases. That's important to keeping it a community-driven project. There's a real tension between the needs of a research project for your campus or departmental personnel review, which can often be in conflict with what community needs and how they need research to be communicated. So we haven't figured out yet how to make this kind of research and scholarship, which is moving the dial on the movement, right? It's part of a movement, count as scholarship. And I don't know how we're going to get there. I know everybody is struggling with this across the country, at universities across the country. But this is something I think to take note of, is that why $1 Million Hoods has been able to retain, I think, what's so special about it, because there's been no effort really to make it part of the university and how the university operates. It remains a community-driven initiative that doesn't try to succumb to the demands of the academy.
On that, a colleague of mine at University of Delaware, Yasser Payne, who is a social psychologist by training, does a lot of participatory action research as a model. He started largely in New York City, but now that he's based in in Delaware, he's been doing a lot of work in and around Delaware. And it's interesting to think of sort of, again, the notion that when the community, right, because that's central to PAR research, right? The community members are driving the research questions, they're driving the research agenda. But what happens when the university kind of is like, but we're funding this thing and this is our work, and that balance. And so I'd be interested to know how folks who do community-oriented research generally navigate that space. And so that was just kind of a thought. I'm going to get back to our questions here, but it just came to mind because I do think a lot about his work regularly on some of the work that I'm seeing him do in and around the community. So Kay Wilson asked, how important were bilingual skills in this work?
Yeah, hugely important, right? So one, in working in the archive, right? Being able to grapple with a variety of records, the oral histories, we needed a bilingual team. And then one thing that we began doing before the shutdown and need to continue doing is making sure we translate all of our reports that come out. I always like to say that I think we're probably the most diverse big data team in the country. We are Black, Brown, and Indigenous led. And no one has challenged me on this yet, but I don't think that there's another team out there like us. And we have spent quite a amount of time curating this brilliant, beautiful team of data analysts so that we can work seamlessly with our communities. So there's not a divide between our data team and community. We are actually all coming out of most impacted communities. And that's where working with the university and working with students who are learning the skills in their policy programs, who are learning these skills in their epidemiology programs, and coming together across discipline has been really, really beneficial to the team.
So another question from the audience from Marianne. How did you ensure continuity of the relationships with community partners through the academic year and students coming and going and graduating? Are community members compensated for their involvement in any way? So two-part question here from Marianne.
So the first part, Marianne, is we're embedded in community organizations. So for example, we sit on the executive board of the Justice LA Coalition, which is a coalition of numerous community-based organizations and advocacy groups in Los Angeles. So we are on every call, right? And part of that project, that initiative. When it comes to compensating community members, when we worked on the oral histories, certainly we compensated folks for that. We are now, as we move into this age of, or archiving the age of mass incarceration, going to be hiring community members to advise the project, to help us make decisions around priorities of collection in the LAPD records, help us to write the instrument tools for oral histories, all of that. Community members will be brought on board as equal partners receiving the same pay as a faculty advisor on the project.
Yeah, and so now the questions are coming in at a constant flow. I like this. Marissa Nichols asked, could you talk about this shift from mapping to archiving? And what types of materials have you been able to include that we might not typically see in a state archive, for example?
Okay, good question. So we're going to continue mapping, and right now, we're still in a process of planning for this transition. But as of now, what the plan is to do is there's a long-term archival project that we're developing, which is developing the capacity of the UCLA Ethnic Studies Research Centers to maintain digital collections across the long haul, right? That 100-year plan. At the same time, we're going to be using the $1 Million Hoods maps to more quickly drop some of this research. So mapping the residents of people who are providing oral histories, mapping where the LAPD records are coming from in the archive, and making our $1 Million Hoods maps around the $1 Million Hoods richer with new data and new information drawn from oral histories and archives. So it's a two-prong attack. One is short-term, movement-driven. Right now, what additional data do we need? What additional narratives do we need? Because we're in the middle of a narrative fight right now, that as we're about to shrink the size of policing and incarceration, if not abolish, right? There's a narrative struggle at play about the outcomes of those sets of decisions. And so we are pushing back against the notion that the surge that we're seeing now in Los Angeles of violence, of homicide in particular, is being cast as the responsibility of fewer police officers on the street, not as due to an extraordinary economic and social and psychological crisis that our communities are facing, right? So we're in a narrative battle, and the oral histories help us with that work.
Yeah, no, that's real. Yes, I'll leave my thoughts aside for a second because again, we could chat all day. But another question from the audience is, Did you find this work alongside the community spurred professional interest in exploring new areas of employment like data analysis or policy?
Is that a question for myself personally,
Yeah.
or?
Well, it
Well,
seems like they want to know, are you thinking about leaving us in academia because of all these professional interests? No, but no, I guess thinking about new areas of employment opportunities certainly, I guess, can be taken personally, but also thinking about potential students and stuff. What kind of avenues can they explore from working with projects like this too?
Oh, it's been a great launch pad for students to go off to graduate school or to go off to Google. One of the things that I have seen happen is we've had students of color, women of color in computer science programs, graduate degree programs, who are feeling isolated, right, and under attack in their day-to-day work that they're doing. So, for example, police documents and data is very common to use in a computer science course, but they're being asked to legitimate the police state, right, in that coursework. When they come to us, they find a whole new way of working with that data set, and speak to and from the experiences that they and their family members have had. And then they thrive, right, personally and intellectually and technically. And so then they go off and they go to Google and they go to these other places with much stronger legs under them. And so that's part of what we've been able to do. I don't see myself right now leaving the academy. I like the freedom that we have to pursue these interests. I can't say what the future holds, but right now the academy is my place.
It's good to know. It's good to know. And so they did want to follow up that they were asking more specifically about community members who are underemployed and now having new skill sets.
Yes, so we run a summer project called Big Data for Justice, which is for undergraduate, well, it's for students and community members who don't have experience with data to come in and learn some basics, right? So whether it be with GIS or with R and other languages, programming languages, it's an entry point that we're hoping to open up for people who are looking to get into data science. So that's part of what we're doing. I mean, of course, a lot of people will come in and they'll play with it. They'll find us interesting, and not everyone's going to continue. But if we could, produce 15 more people with master's degrees in computer science or master's degrees in indigenous studies and GIS, that would be a major contribution in and of itself.
That's funny, and as other questions come in, I'll use this opportunity. I was literally talking with my students earlier today about computer science because I was a computer science major my first 3 semesters of college. And they asked me why I quit. I told them I didn't quit, I just moved on. But in discussing or in having the conversation about computer science, I told them how important it was for me as somebody in the humanities and in history of learning logic behind programming, and how applicable it became to even crafting a logical sound argument in thesis form. Because so much of the programming is, written in languages that are like if statements, right? And that if statements don't work, then the program crashes. It's a flaw in the argument, right? And I think a lot about that in terms of the crossovers between, computer science specifically, but thinking about programming, and the humanities, right? In a way that I typically find myself encouraging students in the humanities, in history, in African American studies, that if they have opportunities to take courses in computer science or take courses that are applied logic, to jump on it. Because there's a skill set there that I do think is useful to kind of cross-pollinate, if you will. But I will say, from a computer science perspective, they laughed when I shared this story. They were like, well, why'd you leave? And I said, I had a computer science professor tell me in my first semester of college, computers are moving so fast that by the time you graduate from here, everything you learn will be obsolete. And I found that to be the most discouraging statement. And so I was just like, history it is, right? So I jumped into stuff way in the past, right? I said, this stuff isn't going to change, only the interpretations will. And I killed enough time there to bring in some more questions from the audience. Um, so Abby Hafer asks, thank you so much for this presentation. We'd love to hear more about how this project might have changed your relationship to or perspective on academia and humanities research. What are the responsibilities of the university to engage effectively in public humanities? And any advice on how to make the shift from training in the ivory tower to engaging in meaningful computer work or community work? I read it as computer, sorry.
Well, I wish I had the answer to that question. I know for myself as a historian, right, and the work I do with graduate students now is probably quite different than I used to do. And one of the things that I emphasize now is more writing, is the ability to tell a story and to craft a narrative and to make sure that that writing is not only this thing we call accessible, but compelling, right? And that it isn't answering questions solely that have germinated in the academy, right? That they're answering broader questions that you're hearing on the streets, in the media, that we need to be relevant. We cannot just tell stories to 10 other people who are going to write it in our tenure files. We have to tell stories that help to move hearts and move minds to make other sets of decisions. And even from the history field, that's extraordinarily important. We shape how people understand social problems and crises. And so I really want to make sure I'm training students to engage in those battles over definitions and narratives about the crisis of our day-to-day lives today. So history is a way of understanding the present and a way of imagining the future. So for me, doing this kind of engaged work, getting off of the campus, being thoroughly accountable to community partners as opposed to like an academic mentor, which are beautiful things as well, right? Has really helped me to change my own writing style, but train students, empower them and give them space to think about other audiences.
Yeah. And another question here, straight from the audience, Elizabeth Bounds asks, have there been barriers to corporate cooperation on the university side? This question comes from experience that while Emory has a strong constellation of graduate schools, along with 2 colleges, there can be challenges in cross-school collaboration among faculty, though not students. It is often linked to the what research counts point, which has already been noted.
You know, it's a good question, and I'm sure that there are some boundaries. I'll be honest with you, I just don't pay them any attention, right? So that's how we're able to do this. I don't ask, I apologize, and we keep it trucking. And I have to say that at the end of the day, UCLA has been quite supportive of this project, institutionally speaking. I don't mean financially, but I mean in creating spaces for it to thrive, in providing students and faculty access to the work that we're doing, shifting the way that they're developing their own programs around computer science to learn from what we've been doing and to incorporate what we're doing. You know, on the whole, we've been able to work fairly well at the university. And it's always been as a team, it's our notion that we're extracting the resources of the university, which are deep and profound, and deploying them with community members to change the conditions of our lives. And at that level, I haven't experienced a lot of pushback from what you would call upper administration here at the university.
It's my first time using Zoom. That's why I was still muted. So I have a question that actually kind of comes directly out of that is and something that you had mentioned a little bit earlier is really just thinking about I guess, at what point, and I don't want this to come, this is, like being recorded. I am pre-tenure, but at what at what point do you, do you say, I've done my due diligence for academia, it's time for me to give back in this type of way, in this type of meaningful way, right? And I do realize that there are going to be regular kind of barriers, right? Which I think some folks have dropped in the chat with regards to thinking about different institutions. But I think specifically about being at like a private school, right, in relation to a public school, and what that means in the ability to hold people accountable to the community in the same type of way. If you get far out into Atlanta and you ask different people around the community what's their relation to Emory as an institution, right? I'd imagine the conversations would look a lot like, and this is speculation, right? Would look a lot like the conversations that people in the community think about UCLA, right? That it's kind of invasive, right? And it's invasive in the sense that there isn't this type of like back and forth relationship or mutual relationship. And so to see something like $1 Million Hoods come out is promising to people in the community. But how would the encouragement of thinking, how do you do that in a private school space, of being able, of having these really difficult conversations with folks about like building the relationship and building the trust and building these kind of, again, mutual relationships between the community in which Emory is, seen as sort of taking over, I guess.
So is the question about how we built those mutual relationships, or what was the question?
So I guess, if you could share insight on how you went about building the relationship, right? Because I'm assuming that in Los Angeles, especially in the communities, right, the perception of UCLA as an institution is sort of like this invasive monstrosity. Here, and Andrea dropped it in the comments, right? Folks think Emory is a hospital first before they even think of it as a university. But either way, they still see it as sort of an institution that is in the community but disconnected from the community, right? So thinking about how to forge that type of relationship.
So one of the things I kept hearing everywhere we were going was, hey, it's nice to see UCLA show up, right? So UCLA had been fairly absent from the public dialogue on many fronts, right? And I'm not as aware of the hospital, so that I'm going to bracket that off to the side, because I'm sure that has a very strong, people have a strong analysis of that. Again, and we didn't know what we were doing. We were stumbling forward. We didn't know the rules, so we broke them all the time, right? And in some ways, that was our saving grace. We weren't reading the literature on community engaged scholarship. We were just going to all the meetings and doing what we were told by community members. Like, this is what we need. This is the date we need it. And abiding by the academic standards of research, right? All the time, and saying, well, this is what we're finding. Okay, well, we've got this campaign. Well, that's not what we found. So we got to, we're going back and forth all the time. It's a conversation. And when our research is useful, we work together to deploy it. How have we done that? I think it's by being really present in the community, right? And at meetings, at gatherings, convenings, at fights, right? And I mean, political fights, and not just dropping in and dropping out when there's a research report, right? It's just the constancy of being there. And our undergraduate students have been a big part of that linkage, right? But so have our graduate students, and I do as much of that work as I can as well. I don't know how else we've done this, to tell you the truth, other than just trying to stay open, listen, and know who the true authors are of this story, right? And make sure that we are abiding by that principle at all times.
Right. Yeah. And so we are running up against the hour. I just took a look at the clock for kind of the first time. So, I mean, if anybody has a last question that they would like to sneak in right before the buzzer, feel free to drop it in the chat. And if, oh, we got one. All right, here it is. Last question coming from the audience. Are your undergraduate students mainly local or from other areas in California or outside the state? And how does that impact continuity with the community?
Our undergrads are both. They're local and they're from across the state. And I have to say, some of our undergrads have been really pivotal in helping us to build new relationships in other communities, San Jose and elsewhere. With that said, I think about 2 years ago, we tried to expand across the state of California into key areas where we were building those relationships, and it just hasn't worked. That kind of embeddedness we just discussed, we've never been able to replicate anywhere. And so we've pulled back from that and we've returned just to Los Angeles. This is our roots, this is our base, and we're going to dig in here. And this is why it's important that we start to develop a narrative of how we've built this. So if other people want to learn from this example, take some pieces, leave some pieces, great. But we can't move outside of LA. This is where we are. This is our home. This is where we're most effective, and we can maintain those really close relationships that are important to this work. Doing this kind of analysis with the data that is really trauma informed, right? What I've experienced through policing, people are saying, helps me to interpret this data around the charges. Or, for example, the sheriff's department may tell you that they're not incarcerating any women on prostitution charges, right? Well, women will tell you that's a lie, right? And so a regular data analyst would dismiss those numbers because they're relatively small, but by working with community, we're actually saying, no, this is happening. And I'm spending time inside on these charges, and I need my part of the story to be told and not dismissed, right? Because it's a small portion of the data, but it's the hugest part of my life. And so that kind of trauma-informed, experience-informed look at the data has been pivotal. And that takes trust. That doesn't just come out of one meeting or two meetings. They need to know that we're going to respect their story, we're going to hold their experience, and that the way that they're seeing the data matters. And so, yeah, so we won't be expanding outside of Los Angeles, but we're happy to partner with folks or have conversations.
I dream of the $1 Million Hoods Atlanta project. I'll talk about that on the other side of tenure. But no, thank you, Kelly, for as always, kind of bracing us with your presence, your knowledge, your ideas, your thinking, your work. If you have any closing remarks that you would like to offer.
Well, just thank you for having me here today. And I look forward, I think it's my second talk at Emory this year. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. And just a kudos to you all for what it seems, what I've learned a little bit about the allyship and the work that you're doing across Latinx and Black African-American communities on this issue of the carceral state, and more important, decarceration and movement toward abolition. It's going to take all of us and the different ways that we've experienced the regime working together to claw it back. So bravo to you all. It's not easy work, and I see and acknowledge what you're doing. So thank you for having me here today.
No, thank you for having, and to all the guests, thank you all for coming out on this Thursday evening. Again, next week, there is, let me pull up the title again, just so I don't, and it's not next week, next month, April 23rd, a panel featuring members of the Black Latinas No Collective. Again, with this collaborative effort between the JWJI and the Latinx Studies faculty here at Emory. With that, good night to everyone, and I'll see you all when we see you.